With the wind shifting further to the north, Vagabond had one long tack across the bay to Crisfield. Despite the extra ton of weight from the new passengers and their luggage, she plugged along at 6 or 7 knots until she had gotten within 2 miles of the town, and the wind fell. Then her speed dropped to 2 knots and she began to wallow and crawl. Neil hailed a small cruiser and bribed its owner to tow them the last 2 miles to the dock. The trip was uneventful. Although thin wisps of the dark cloud mass over Washington seemed to have floated almost directly overhead, there were no obvious signs of radioactive fallout. The 10 passengers displayed a kind of stunned obedience that made the boat handling easy. Jean had spent the first hour and a half below, but with Skippy napping and Lisa helping Jim at the helm, she came up and stood beside Neil in the port cockpit. He was again aware of her as a woman, her bare brown legs and arms set off by the white shorts and shirt. Her long hair was brushed now and tied on top of her head. She stared forward for a while without speaking. "Do you think Frank will be there?" she finally asked. "There's no way of knowing," he answered. "We'll just have to see." "And then what?" "I suppose that will be mostly up to Frank," he said after a pause. "We should leave," she said with unexpected force. "Get out of the country." He glanced at her. She seemed more angry than fearful. "I agree," he said, "but I'm afraid Frank does not." "I just listened to a radio down in the cabin," she went on. "The whole world is collapsing." Neil felt a tremor of fear, partly because of what she said and partly because of her intensity. "I imagine it is. And we've done it," she continued, staring forward. "Our country and Russia are destroying the world." Neil was aware that 2 of the women sitting in the wheelhouse were looking at her uneasily. "If we live through this madness, we'll have to create a new world," she said, and her eyes seeming to make a personal appeal to Neil. "We'll have to create a family, support each other, put an end to the selfish distinctions that led us to this horror." She looked at him for confirmation. Neil felt an unaccountable heaviness. He supposed it was because he didn't think the species that had killed 100 million of its own kind in one day was likely to be too great on its next go-around, if there was a next go-around. "First, we have to survive," he replied. "Yes," she said, seemed to relent somewhat. "But my God, how cold-hearted this war is making us survivors. I think you're the only friendly face I've seen all day." "Cornered and fleeing animals aren't nice," Neil said. She nodded and frowned. "Back before you rescued me, I could have killed someone with that butcher knife," she said softly, looking quite puzzled and a little saddened by the knowledge. "How depressing is that?" Neil didn't comment. 2 passengers were leaning out over the combing in the port cockpit, and he wondered why until he saw that one of them was being seasick. "And that way madness lies," Jean went on, and then paused and looked up at him. "I'm glad I spared you." And suddenly and unexpectedly she was smiling up at him. "I am too," he replied, smiling back. "My personal Captain Gluck," she said. "How so?" he said, puzzled. "Well, you said that before we can create a new world, we have to find the luck to survive." She said, strangely gay all of a sudden, "I guess I found you." She paused. "Though I hope your style isn't always to throw me overboard." After the horror of Point Lookout, Crisfield was as quiet and relaxed as a picturesque fishing village should be. There were no mobs and few boats. Neil supposed that survivors from Philadelphia area had more escape routes open to them than those who were south and east of Washington and Baltimore. After Vagabond was tied up at the dock in front of a large green fishing trawler named the Lucky Emerald, he helped his passengers ashore. Most were bewildered. It seemed to Neil that if someone had offered them a boat ride back to Point Lookout, many of them would have crowded aboard. As they were leaving, Jean came up beside him, where he stood overseeing the exodus. "Can't we invite some of them to stay with us?" she asked him. "That's Frank's decision," he replied, feeling like something of a liar. "When he comes, we can reconsider it. They have no place to go." "And we have nothing to feed them with," Neil explained. "I was in their place 4 hours ago," she said, looking away. "I know," he said gently, frowning. "But we can't save everybody. We'll be lucky if we can save ourselves." "We should try to save as many as we can," she said. "We haven't even enough food to last ourselves more than 2 or 3 days," he went on. "That's our job now, to try and get some supplies aboard." "I'd like to invite that woman with the baby," Jean persisted. Neil looked at the retreating passengers. "All right, Jean," he answered, "but explain to her about the food situation." While Jean hurried forward to overtake the nursing mother, Neil turned to speak to Jim. and as he did he saw the man with the .45 was still sitting on the settee, and beside him the much younger man with the pink shirt and green pants. Neil went over to them. "What are your plans?" he asked the older man. "What are yours?" "We wait here until 10 to pick up the owner, then we're probably heading out into the bay into the Atlantic." "All right." "All right what?" "We'd like to come along." Neil studied the man. His business suit seemed somehow inappropriate, fraudulent. His round and shaven face never seemed to lose its placid expression. The young man beside him looked morose. "Who are you?" Neil asked. "Conrad Macklin," he replied, "and this is my friend Jerry." "What do you do?" The man shrugged. "I used to be a Marine," he said, "paramedic. After Vietnam I flew planes, freelancing. Now I sail a trimaran." "We don't have much food," Neil said. Macklin shrugged again. "We're going shopping," Neil said, starting to feel irritated. "Could you two contribute some cash to the cause?" Macklin took out his billfold, removed 2 bills, and handed them to Neil. They were hundreds. "Jim," Neil said, turning away, "I want you and Jean to go into town to the nearest supermarket and buy everything you can carry. I'll give you $300 and don't hesitate to pay double for anything you can get. Triple if you have to." Jean reappeared in the wheelhouse alone. "What happened?" Neil asked. "She'd hooked up with a man and he had a car," she answered, apparently disappointed with her that her offer had been rejected. Neil wrote out a brief list of basics for Jean and Jim and sent them off. Skippy had fallen asleep during the crossing, so Neil had Lisa begin making an inventory of the supplies already on hand. Although uneasy about the presence of Macklin and his friend, he decided Macklin already had what he wanted, namely a boat to escape in, so now there should be nothing to worry about. He took a few minutes to get Lisa started on the inventory and was impressed by how quickly she worked. Then he went back up into the wheelhouse. "I've got an important job I'd like you to do for us," he said to Macklin. "Yeah?" "The boat's got a bent propeller shaft and we can't get it out," Neil explained. "We need a slide hammer puller. It's a tool. I want you to try the boatyard over there and see if you can rent, buy or borrow one. How about it?" "Why don't you go?" Macklin asked. Neil met the man's cold gaze with equal coldness. "You'll help when I ask you to help, or you're not sailing with us," he said, feeling absurdly for an instant as if he were in some western and both he and Macklin were about to go for their guns. Macklin in fact looked down at the pistol in his lap and caressed the barrel with his left hand. "That sounds reasonable," Macklin said, and standing up, put the gun into a shoulder holster beneath his suit jacket. He smiled for the first time. "Relax, Captain," he went on. "I'm just out to save my ass like the rest of you." "A slide hammer puller," Neil repeated coldly. "Got it," Macklin said, and ambled off the boat. "And I want you," Neil said to the man named Jerry, "to go along the docks and see if there's an outlet we can get water from." The man, who seemed to be only a couple of years older than Jim, nodded and went off. The other thing is fishing gear, Neil thought, and his mind immediately returned to the task of preparing the boat for a long survival voyage. It would help if they had extra nylon line and metal lures, another rod maybe too. Those might actually be easier to pick up than food. He looked restlessly ashore. Jean and Jim were already returning empty-handed. The two of them jumped down onto the side deck and came over to him. "There was a line 40 yards long outside the supermarket," Jean explained, "and then the manager came out, carried off 20 people and told the rest of us to go home. Every other grocery store was closed," Jim added. "Half of them were boarded up and the others had an armed guard." Neil simply nodded. "Give me the money, Jean," he said. As Jean fished in her pocket, he said to Jim, "We need to get water aboard, all we can get. I sent that guy Jerry to locate an open tap. Fill the tank and all the plastic jugs." "How about that leaky 10-gallon container?" Jim asked. "That too," Neil replied. "I sent Macklin, that's the one with the .45, after the puller. I'm going to take a shot at getting us some supplies. Stay here and get your .22 out again. Don't let anybody aboard except Macklin. When he's back, have him stand guard." "You trust him?" Jim asked. "I trust him to keep unnecessary people off the boat," Neil explained. "Okay." Neil hesitated, gauging Jim's character. "This time," he began, as Jim looked at him attentively, "if you feel the need to shoot, shoot." "Macklin?" asked Jim. "Anybody," Neil replied. The situation in Crisfield was just as Jean and Jim had described it. Fortunately, the local hardware store was open. "Cash only," a clerk replied as he entered. "All prices triple, what's marked?" Neil went to the fishing gear section and quickly picked out 3 lures, 2 wire leaders and 500 feet of 30-pound test line. As he walked over to the cashier, he grabbed 2 kerosene lanterns. The manager said he didn't sell kerosene, but Neil bought the lamps anyway. Back out on the main street, considered his tactics. He'd hidden his gun under a loose-fitting jacket and a bag of supplies he was carrying. He'd become aware throughout the day of a feeling he hadn't had for a long time, that he was ready and able to kill, that he had killed in the past, and that this readiness gave him a power and a confidence in this situation that was essential for survival. He felt he could sense when others lacked that readiness, as with the grey-haired man on the yawl who had kidnapped Jean, and when they did have it, as Macklin did. This feeling of power had always bothered him, ever since he'd first sensed it in Vietnam more than a decade ago. He knew that now it was one of his chief assets. Neil passed a closed grocery store, behind the door of which sat a fat man with a shotgun across his knees. Neil felt it would be easy enough to take such a store, but it didn't feel right, and he walked on. Ahead he saw a line of about 12 people outside a large food town store. He went round to the back. The first door he came to was locked, but at the other end of the building he saw another. A man in a white apron was leaving with an armload of boxes. When Neil followed him back to the door, he turned around. "Can't come this way," the young man said. Neil pulled out a $100 bill and held it out to him. "I'd like to go in and do a little shopping for my family," he said casually. The boy squinted at the bill, grimaced and shook his head. "I just can't do it," he said. "The manager would know." Neil let the bill flutter to the ground and pulled out his gun. "Tell the manager I pulled a gun on you, but that I promised to pay double for all my food." Neil pushed past him, slipped the gun back under his belt, and went in the back of the supermarket. Inside was frenzied order. It was like a normal supermarket, except that everyone was moving twice as fast as usual, and the carts were twice as full. The shelves were 3/4 empty. The room was unlit. The usual harsh glitter of a supermarket was lacking. Neil looked back at the apron clerk, whom he noticed pocketing something, presumably the 100, and patted his waist where the gun was. The boy smirked uneasily. Neil took an empty metal cart, put in the bag of fishing gear, and entered the fray. He knew he'd have to take what he could get, which wasn't much. He found 6 cans of pears and syrup and 8 cans of mixed fruit. That was all that was left in the canned fruit section. In the dried fruit section he was luckier, since dried fruit was ridiculously expensive and not all that essential except to a starving man. There was a lot left. Neil took it all. There were a few boxes of dried noodles and spaghetti, and he threw those in, followed by a large bag of potatoes. Frozen and refrigerated foods were almost gone, which reminded him that Crisfield had no electricity. He wondered whether the lights were out in the rest of the world as well. There were some tin crackers left, and he grabbed them, but all the canned meats were gone. 40 minutes later, his cart overflowing, Neil headed again for the back door. There was a man standing beside him with a rifle, its butt resting awkwardly on the floor. Neil took out all of the rest of his money, $160, and held it out to him. "To save time, I'd like to leave by the back way," he said. "Here's what I owe, plus tip." "What's the trouble, Calvin?" a voice called out behind him. "He wants to leave by the back way," said Calvin. "He has more than enough money to cover my purchases," said Neil. "How much money you got?" $160, Neil said, handing it to him. "Shit, mister," the manager said, taking the money. "This don't cover much more than half of what you got there. Our prices are triple. Then I'll go to my boat and I'll bring back more money." "You do that." Neil pulled out his gun and pointed at the belly of the man with the rifle. "I'll take my food with me now, though," Neil said. "Won't I?" he asked the manager sharply. "Let him go," the manager said, backing away. Neil left. As he pushed the cart across the bumpy back lot of the supermarket, he felt tremendous relief. The food situation had been his greatest worry. Now, although what he had bought normally wouldn't last 6 people more than a week at the most, rationed it might go a month. He had even bought a large container of dog food as a compact, non-perishable source of protein. He picked up the pace when he hit the smoother sidewalk of the main street. It was almost 5 o'clock, and if Macklin had located the puller, he could start work on the propeller shaft before Frank got back. If Frank got back. When he came around the corner and made for the dock, Neil stopped. He could not believe what he was seeing. Ahead of him was the fishing trawler Lucky Emerald, and in front of it was nothing. Vagabond was gone.